Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our special guest is Parker Palmer, a world-renowned writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. Parker, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Kevin. Great to be here.
And welcome back to St. Norbert College.
Thank you very much.
So you were here last in...
Well, we think it was, 1990 or something like
1990.
that? Yeah, it's hard to believe.
But the world's a different place than it was in 1990 in a lot of ways.
Apparently so, and I seem to have gotten older in the process. I have no idea how that happened, but it's the truth.
I think it's an inevitable thing. So, like me, you grew up in the Chicago area.
I did. I was born in the city on the south side, and after a few years, my parents moved up to the North Shore. I did a lot of my growing up in Wilmette, Illinois.
Big difference between the South Side and the North Shore, from what I understand.
That's true, and I think it was in later years that I really came to deeply appreciate the diversity that we didn't have on the North Shore, but that of course is so important for us to embrace and explore and benefit from today.
So talk a little bit about the experiences that you had growing up.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question for me. So a little family history first. My dad grew up in a blue-collar family in Waterloo, Iowa. His dad was a machine tool operator, made parts for John Deere tractors. And my dad came to Chicago when he was 19 years old with a high school diploma in hand. That's as far as he ever got in school. And stood in long lines during the Depression and took a part-time temporary bookkeeping job with a company that sold chinaware and silverware to hotels, restaurants, airlines, railroads in the old days, airlines later. And 50 years later, he was owner and chairman of the board.
Wow.
One of those stories that probably won't happen again, but in that generation, you stayed with a company, and if you were good at what you did, you rose up in the company. Well, the point is that my dad deeply valued his blue-collar roots, and so he raised my two younger sisters and me in Wilmette, Illinois, which is a very affluent suburban community, as if we were a blue-collar family that had sort of accidentally landed there and we didn't know why, but there were things we needed to do, such as when I was 12 years old, he said, "This is the last summer we'll take a family vacation, because from here on out, Park and then his sisters, when they reach 13, have to work all summer." So while my friends were lounging around the country club swimming pool, which we didn't belong to because that's not what a blue-collar family would do, I was carrying golf bags under the blazing sun for their fathers, having gotten up at 4 a.m. to get to the caddy shack and get a good number, and then 2 rounds of 18-hole doubles. Or when they were down at the beach, I was working at the beach as a maintenance man. In later years, my friends, I think, said, didn't that make you feel kind of abused, or mistreated? And I said, on the contrary, it made me feel like a grown-up. It made me feel like I was being given responsibilities to make money, to save money, to put money aside to go to college. And Dad was very consistent in this notion of wanting us to learn the values that had been so important to him growing up in Waterloo, Iowa, with parents, my grandparents, whom I deeply loved. And, when I got older, I understood why all of that was so important to Dad. I feel like I was raised in 2 worlds. One was the affluent world of Wilmette, Illinois, and the other was the blue-collar world that my dad had grown up in Iowa.
I don't think any teenager is poorly served by having to get up at 4:30 in the morning in the summertime and work. And there's a lot less trouble you're going to get into late at night if you have to get up at 4:30 in the morning.
Yeah, absolutely. especially I think privileged kids who need to understand that that privilege is not their birthright. That work is important, and that learning about the lives of people who don't share your privilege is important. And so that's what happened to me being raised the way I was.
And then you went to college in Minnesota, is that correct?
I went to Carleton College in Minnesota, right?
Another small school like St. Norbert.
Right.
What do you remember from the time there? I mean, what still stays with you from that experience?
Well, that's a great question because I value my 4 years at Carleton very much, 1957 to 61. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and I had no self-image as a good student or as a thinker or let alone a writer. But there were several faculty there who saw more in me than I saw in myself. I came in later years, to write about the fact that I think that's one of the key characteristics of a great teacher, that great teachers see more in their students than their students see in themselves. And these teachers poked me and prodded me and patted me on the back and provided me with opportunities to really grow. And I think without Carleton and without those particular mentors whom I stayed close to as long as they were alive, there were 4 of them, there's one still living, and I'll be visiting him again soon. My life was changed, and I started to understand my potentials as a kind of student of the world and someone who wanted to reflect back to the world through teaching and writing and action what it was that I was seeing and thinking about in community with other people. So a lot began happening for me at Carleton that obviously needed deepening and development, but I've always been grateful for the small college experience and for the way a young person is more likely in a small college environment to find that mentor who will take the student under his or her wing and say, you have possibilities that you don't see yet, but I see them and I want to help you develop them.
So you went from there to Berkeley, which had to be a little bit of a culture shock.
Well,
Berkeley in the 60s, I've had the pleasure of being able to interview a number of people who were there in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I sort of am disappointed that I didn't get that opportunity myself.
Well, it was, I actually had a 1-year interlude in New York City at Union Theological Seminary, where I did general theological studies. But you're right, it was then out to Berkeley in the 60s, where I did a master's and a PhD in sociology. And Berkeley in the 60s, was certainly an exciting time, an important time in higher education and in American society and culture. It was also a very mixed reality. I mean, there were people who were falling prey to the drug culture. I was married and I had one child at the time. Eventually we had 3 children. And so I wasn't living on the shadow side of all of that, but it was there, and it's hard to look back, on some of the lives that kind of got lost in the woods during that time. But for me, the impact of Berkeley in the 60s was all about the importance of social change, the importance of coming together in community to help create positive social change, and about my own potentials as a participant in social change. And as a result of that, by the end of the 60s, when I got my PhD, the cities were burning, my heroes had been assassinated, and it became clear to me as a person who's always believed in calling or vocation, out of my own, I think, Christian roots, it became clear to me that I was not being called to academic life. I mean, I had invitations to become a professor at this or that university, but I felt that I was called to use my sociology on the streets in the city. And so I went from Berkeley to Washington, D.C., where I became a community organizer working on racial equity and racial justice in a rapidly changing neighborhood called Tacoma Park, East Silver Spring. I had not been trained as a community organizer, and I had to unlearn and then relearn a lot of academic sociology in order to become a community organizer. But I stayed with that work for 5 years, and it was a very important part of my personal journey and growth and transition. It was hard work. I was thin-skinned, and as a community organizer, you get slings and arrows, you know. And you need to learn to absorb them and move along. And that was a tough uphill battle for me. But I think I cut my eye teeth on social change by just plunging in. We established a small institute called the Institute for Public Life. We worked with a coalition of congregations, Catholic, Jewish, Seventh-day Adventist, mainline Protestant, represented by maybe 35 clergy in what was called the Silver Spring Group Ministry. I wrote a book out of that experience called The Company of Strangers, Christians and the Renewal of America's Public Life. And I regard that as a very important passage in my experience, so important that my most recent book from just a few years ago is called Healing the Heart of Democracy. And it's really, it's the 9th book, and it, in a way, comes full circle back to The Company of Strangers, which I wrote in 1981 out of my experience as a community organizer.
In some ways, both books deal with similar topics. Mm-hmm. So what changed? What changed in America during that time? What changed in you in that, 35 years or so?
Well, I think some things remain the same and some things change. Politics in 1981, while politics has always been a contact sport, as people like to say, there's never been a time in American history when politics wasn't rough and tumble. There's never been a time in American history when there weren't deep rifts and fundamental disagreements among people about the direction of the country. I like to point out that as far back as the Constitutional Convention of 1787, before we even really had a country, 30% of the delegates to that convention walked out, saying a pox on all your houses and refusing to sign the documents because they were so certain that nobody had it right. The form of our country itself was forged out of profound conflict and people actually leaving the room, refusing to talk to the rest of them while the rest of them had to get on with their work. So I don't want to overpaint the picture of conflict and dissent. I actually think that that we have a form of government that is unique in its genius to make conflict and tension not an enemy of a good social order, but the engine of a better social order. We're afraid of conflict and tension. We shouldn't be, because rightly held, it's the driver toward that more perfect union that our founders wrote about. But I do think that a long-term change has been that the conflict and the gaps between us have become deeper, more bitter, and I think that's because they're more manipulated. The power of mass media in this society to implement the ancient strategy of divide and conquer is a bit overwhelming at times, and it's doing no service to our democracy. My appeal is to people left, right, and center to realize that we're being jerked around. And if we could sit down and talk to each other, if we could learn each other's stories, rather than talking about ideology, I want to know what's the life experience behind the political convictions that you hold, because the more you know about another person's story, the less possible it is to hate them or distrust them or dismiss them. If we could do more of that, we would have more fruitful political conversations, and I think we desperately need them.
I think you're right, and actually I find it interesting that millennials aren't as bound by some of those shackles of ideology. When we were growing up, you came from a Democrat home or a Republican home.
Right.
You were a Cubs fan or a Sox fan.
Right.
You were, pro-union, you were anti-union, and you took your ideology wholesale. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, the balkanization or the narrowification, mm-hmm. if you will, of media is playing to a generation that kind of was comfortable with that mm-hmm. sense, team blue versus team red. Millennials don't seem to be that way.
No, I don't think they are. I've often said about millennials that they walk across lines that have divided my generation without even noticing that they're there. Those are sometimes ideological or political lines. There are also racial lines or sexual orientation lines or religious lines. There's a lot of ways in which millennials are simply very comfortable with what we would think of as otherness. And if they do think of it as otherness, they value it. They go toward it, saying as one should, as we all should, oh, here's someone whose life experience is different from mine and who therefore looks at the world differently from the way I do. What can I learn from this person that I might need to know? In all of the world's religious traditions, there's this ancient theme or meme of hospitality to the stranger, hospitality to the one who comes from someplace else and knows things you don't know and believes or embraces things you don't. Well, that hospitality is not just about making nice on each other. It's about the fact that stranger may know things that you need to know in order to take the next steps on your journey. And I think we have a lot to do in this society to revive that ancient virtue of hospitality to the stranger. And that can be as simple as sitting down with someone who disagrees with you and saying, tell me your story. I'd really like to hear it.
A part of that, from our perspective here at St. Norbert, is the role that education can play. Mm-hmm. And you've written extensively. I mean, I know you best through that channel, your thoughts about teaching and education. In your opinion, how does education help promote the values that you wrote about 35 years ago and that you still care about?
Well, as you say, Kevin, I'm a great advocate for good higher education. And I think good higher education, by definition, has very little to do with rote learning. And unfortunately, in our schools these days, because of the pressures of high-stakes testing, there's a fair emphasis on rote learning. There are even teachers who feel compelled across the country to do what they call teach to the test. Here's the test that's coming, here's the facts you'll be required to learn. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to do anything else this semester except get you ready to pass that test, because I'm going to look bad and the school's going to look bad and you're going to look bad if you don't do well on it. And there's just no question in my mind that there's a huge difference between educating a child and getting a child ready to pass a test. Those are two different tasks. Mm-hmm. And the one I believe in is educating a child. So to the extent that higher education carries on with rote learning, then I don't think it speaks very powerfully to the issues that we were just discussing about give and take and dialogue in a democracy. But when higher education, as it is in the best of cases, engages students with a text, with a problem, with a set of data, with each other, with the teacher, with the larger world, in a kind of live encounter, and says, okay, let's sort this out. And we're going to depend on each other to do it. What do you see? What do you see? If you see something different, how can you resolve those differences? Once we've reached some consensus on what we're seeing, how do you explain what we're seeing? How do you explain what we're seeing? And if we differ on that, how do we move ahead with some kind of hypothesis or theory or argument that brings our disparate interpretations together. Good teachers do that kind of thing. It's messy. It doesn't look like 30 kids lined up in a classroom with their heads buried in their notebooks, repeating what the teacher says on the paper and then repeating it back on a test at the end of the term. That may look like education, but it isn't. And it's certainly not preparation for citizenship in a democracy. So I think, that higher education really has to keep reaching for the challenge of engaging students, subjects, and teachers in live encounters, which can get messy. It means the teacher doesn't always have the answer to the problem at hand. We have to work it out together. And for some teachers, that's scary.
That is scary. And that's in a backdrop where education, particularly higher education, is becoming increasingly expensive.
Right.
I mean, relative to incomes. And there is ever more press to view a college degree primarily as career preparation.
Right.
The questions, and I understand it. I mean, if I'm looking at having that kind of a bill and coming out with a certain amount of debt, which many students do, I want to have some understanding that I'm going to be able to pay that back.
Right.
So how in that environment can we be truly inspirational as teachers, as opposed to, well, you better learn this accounting or you're never going to get a job? How do we get past that?
Well, I don't for a minute want to be heard saying that there aren't certain basic facts that people have to master or certain basic techniques. Of course there are. But I'm totally baffled by this effort to sell the notion that unless you sit in your chairs for 4 years, shut up and listen to what the experts are saying, put it down on paper and then feed it back on the test, you won't be prepared for the job market. That argument makes zero sense to me, precisely because the job market is changing so rapidly and demands people who know how to think on their feet, who know how to ask questions that aren't being asked at this moment, and who know how to find answers that aren't at the back of the book. It's the people who have the rote preparation that are going to find themselves running out of vocational gas 5 or 10 years down the road. I talked about my dad earlier, who started with a company when he was 19, and 50 years later, he's owner and chairman of the board of that same company, which sold Chinaware and silverware. It was a wonderful company. He ran it in a tremendously ethical way. He was the best man I ever knew and a highly ethical businessman as well as a great father. But there are very, very few, if any, of today's college graduates who are going to have that kind of straight line career pattern. Rising up in the same company, doing essentially the same thing year in and year out, learning something a little new and a little new each year, but all around the same product set, the same market dynamics, et cetera, et cetera.
Students don't want to do that.
They don't want to do that.
That's not their aspiration.
And they're not going to have opportunity to do that even if they want it. What are the estimates these days? The typical person is going to have 7, 8, 9 job changes in the course of a career. What does that require? That requires constant discernment of what's going on in the world. And the jobs that you're going to get, if you're looking for good jobs, are not rote mechanical jobs. They're jobs that require this capacity to engage a mess creatively and begin to make some order out of it. So I think the first thing that has to be done is that colleges have to deliver a strong message to students and to their parents, who in many cases are paying the bills or some of the bills, that you've been sold a bill of goods about what a good education looks like. It doesn't look like sitting down, shutting up, and taking notes. It looks like getting engaged with messy stuff and learning how to think on your feet and learning how to ask questions that aren't being asked and find answers that aren't yet known. That just seems to me crystal clear in this rapidly changing job market. So, I think in every significant line of work, there's the challenge to get ahead of the curve or get ahead of the train wreck. And that means being imaginative, and that means being original, and that means being creative. And none of that is cultivated by the traditional model of sit down, shut up, listen to the expert, and then feed it back. And we have to tell parents and students that. And we have to say, look, if that's not what you're looking for, then this isn't the place for you. But please, consider carefully. If you insist on what you're looking for, your child is going to have less of a chance at a good vocational future than if you go this other route.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the other side of that, which are the teachers that have to remain inspired. I mean, you talk about, and I've been a teacher for most of my adult life in one form or another. It's a very personal thing to be a teacher. And
Right.
I think in recent years you've greatly expanded that and think about the professions in general. So how is it that we keep people sufficiently fresh and inspired so that their best selves can be put to use, and maybe in that kind of a profession?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I actually think that one of the most important answers to it is that teachers shouldn't spend year in and year out in the classroom. They need to cycle in and out of other kinds of experiences from time to time. And I understand they're needed in the classroom, but I also understand that they won't be fresh and revitalized if a guy who's teaching business doesn't dip back into the business world for a summer or a semester, or a guy who's teaching fine art doesn't go off and do his own art in a cabin in Vermont for a few months, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The English teacher doesn't have a chance to write his or her version of the great American novel, or even to just take a walk on the other side of the street and do something that's totally out of the box for academics. There's a great story about a college president whose name escapes me at the moment, but who regularly would take a summer job as a short order cook, or as a boatman on a river with a river rafting company, or as a park ranger, just to shake up his view of the world and come back to campus with fresh perspective and new learning. It seems like what do those things have to do with being a college president? Well, in terms of refreshing the spirit and shaking up the mind and rearranging the pieces, I think they have everything in the world to do. This better model of education that we've been talking about, where, for example, a professor crafts a piece of research with the help of his students and then engages the students in doing the research. I think that can help freshen the teacher's life, much more so than opening the notes to the same lectures that he or she gave a year ago and starting to give them again. I always tell people, I do a lot of lecturing, and they say, are you willing to have Q&A at the end? And I said, oh my heavens, I'll die if I don't have Q&A at the end. Why? Because I already know what I'm going to say during the lecture, and frankly, it bores me a little. But in the Q&A, I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm going to be, with good questions, I'm going to be taken up to and beyond the edge of my own knowledge. And that's going to energize me and vitalize me and give me the next thing that I need to learn. And that's where the vitality comes from.
I think about politicians that have to give the same stump speech all the time. I don't know how they do it. And I am getting the sign here that we're out of time.
Amazing.
I can't believe it. That's one of the fastest half hours I can imagine.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you.
And I hope you all have enjoyed our show too. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.